Fiction and non-fiction are only different techniques of storytelling. For reasons that I don't fully understand, fiction dances out of me, and non-fiction is wrenched out by the aching, broken world I wake up to every morning. The theme of much of what I write, fiction as well as non-fiction, is the relationship between power and powerlessness, and the endless circular conflict they're engaged in. I have so many things to say, and I hope I don't take too long to say them to you. I'm a writer, and so I've actually written what I want to say for two reasons. One, because I'm sure that you're much more interested in the way I write than in the way I speak. And second, because the things I have to say are complicated, dangerous things in these dangerous times, and I think we have to be very, very precise about what we're saying and how we say them and the language that we use. So I hope it's okay if I read it out to you. My talk today is called Come September. Writers imagine that they cull stories from the world. I'm beginning to believe that vanity makes them think so, that it's actually the other way around. Stories cull writers from the world. Stories reveal themselves to us, the public narrative, the private narrative. They colonize us, they commission us, they insist on being told. Fiction and non-fiction are only different techniques of storytelling. For reasons that I don't fully understand, fiction dances out of me, and non-fiction is wrenched out by the aching, broken world I wake up to every morning. The theme of much of what I write, fiction as well as non-fiction, is the relationship between power and powerlessness, and the endless circular conflict they're engaged in. John Berger, that most wonderful writer, once wrote, "Never again will a single story be told as though it's the only one." There can never be a single story. There are only ways of seeing. So when I tell a story, I tell it not as an ideologue who wants to pit one absolutist ideology against another, but as a storyteller who wants to share her way of seeing. Though it might appear otherwise, my writing is not really about nations and histories. It's about power, about the paranoia and ruthlessness of power, about the physics of power. I believe that the accumulation of vast, unfettered power by a state or a country, a corporation or an institution, or even an individual, a spouse, a friend, a sibling, regardless of ideology, results in excesses such as the ones I will recount here. Living as I do, as millions of us do, in the shadow of the nuclear holocaust that the governments of India and Pakistan keep promising their brainwashed citizenry, and in the global neighborhood of the war against terror, what President Bush rather biblically calls the task that never ends. I find myself thinking a great deal about the relationship between citizens and the state. In India, those of us who have expressed views on nuclear bombs, big dams, corporate globalization, and the rising threat of communal Hindu fascism, views that are at variance with the Indian governments, are branded anti-national. While this accusation doesn't fill me with indignation, it's not an accurate description of what I do or how I think. Because an anti-national is a person who is against his or her own nation and by inference is pro some other one. But it isn't necessary to be anti-national to be deeply suspicious of all nationalism, to be anti-nationalism. Nationalism of one kind or another was the cause of most of the genocide of the 20th century. Flags are bits of colored cloth that governments use first to shrink wrap people's brains and then as ceremonial shrouds to bury the dead. When independent thinking people, and here I do not include the corporate media, begin to rally under flags, when writers, painters, musicians, filmmakers suspend their judgment and blindly yoke their art to the service of the nation, it's time for all of us to sit up and worry. In India, we saw it happen soon after the nuclear tests in 1998 and during the Kargil war against Pakistan in 1999. In the US, we saw it during the Gulf War, and we see it now during the war against terror, that blizzard of made in China American flags. Recently, those who have criticized the actions of the US government, myself included, have been called anti-American. Anti-Americanism is in the process of being consecrated into an ideology. The term anti-American is usually used by the American establishment to discredit and not falsely, but shall we say inaccurately define its critics. Once someone is branded anti-American, the chances are that he or she will be judged before they are heard, and the argument will be lost in the welter of bruised national pride. But what does the term anti-American mean? Does it mean you're anti-jazz, or that you're opposed to free speech, that you don't delight in Toni Morrison or John Updike, that you have a quarrel with giant sequoias? Does it mean that you don't admire the hundreds of thousands of American citizens who marched against nuclear weapons, or the thousands of war resistors who forced their government to withdraw from Vietnam? Does it mean that you hate all Americans? This sly conflation of America's culture, music, literature, the breathtaking physical beauty of the land, the ordinary pleasures of ordinary people, with criticism of the US government's foreign policy, about which, thanks to America's free press, sadly most Americans know very little, is a deliberate and extremely effective strategy. It's like a retreating army taking cover in a heavily populated city, hoping that the prospect of hitting civilian targets will deter enemy fire. But there are many Americans who would be mortified to be associated with their government's policies. The most scholarly, scathing, incisive, hilarious critiques of the hypocrisy and the contradictions in US government policy come from American citizens. When the rest of the world wants to know what the US government is up to, we turn to Noam Chomsky, Edward Said, Howard Zinn, Ed Herman, Amy Goodman, Michael Albert, Chalmers Johnson, William Bloom, and Anthony Arnov to tell us what's really going on. Similarly, in India, not hundreds but millions of us would be ashamed and offended if we were in any way implicated with the present Indian government's fascist policies, which, apart from the perpetration of state terrorism in the Valley of Kashmir in the name of fighting terrorism, have also turned a blind eye to the recent state-supervised pogrom against Muslims in Gujarat. It would be absurd to think that those who criticize the Indian government are anti-Indian, although the government itself never hesitates to take that line. It is dangerous to cede to the Indian government or the American government, or anyone for that matter, the right to define what India or America are or ought to be. To call someone anti-American, indeed to be anti-American, or for that matter, anti-Indian or anti-Timbuktuan, is not just racist, it's a failure of the imagination. An inability to see the world in terms other than those the establishment has set out for you. If you're not a Bushi, you're a Taliban. If you don't love us, you hate us. If you're not good, you're evil. If you're not with us, you're with the terrorists. Last year, like many others, I too made the mistake of scoffing at this post-September 11 rhetoric, dismissing it as foolish and arrogant. But I realized that it's not foolish at all. It's actually a canny recruitment drive for a misconceived, dangerous war. Every day I'm taken aback at how many people believe that opposing the war in Afghanistan amounts to supporting terrorism or voting for the Taliban. Now that the initial aim of the war, capturing Osama bin Laden, dead or alive, seems to have run into bad weather, the goalposts have been moved. It's being made out the whole point of the war was to topple the Taliban regime and liberate Afghan women from their burqas. We are being asked to believe that the US Marines are actually on a feminist mission. If so, will their next stop be America's military ally, Saudi Arabia? Think of it this way. In India, there are some pretty reprehensible social practices against untouchables, against Christians and Muslims, against women. Pakistan and Bangladesh have even worse ways of dealing with minority communities and women. Should they be bombed? Should Delhi, Islamabad, and Dhaka be destroyed? Is it possible to bomb bigotry out of India? Can we bomb our way to a feminist paradise? Is that how women won the vote in the US? Or how slavery was abolished? Can we win redress for the genocide of the millions of Native Americans upon whose corpses the United States was founded by bombing Santa Fe? None of us need anniversaries to remind us of what we cannot forget. So it's no more than coincidence that I happen to be here on American soil in September, this month of dreadful anniversaries. Uppermost on everybody's mind, of course, particularly here in America, is the horror of what has come to be known as 9/11. Nearly 3,000 civilians lost their lives in that lethal terrorist strike. The grief is still deep, the rage still sharp. The tears have not dried, and a strange, deadly war is raging round the world. Yet each person who has lost a loved one surely knows, secretly, deeply, that no war, no act of revenge, no daisy cutters dropped on someone else's loved ones or someone else's children will blunt the edges of their pain or bring their own loved ones back. War cannot avenge those who have died. War is only a brutal desecration of their memory. To fuel yet another war, this time against Iraq, by cynically manipulating people's grief, by packaging it for TV specials sponsored by corporations selling detergent and running shoes, is to cheapen and devalue grief, to drain it of meaning. What we are seeing now is a vulgar display of the business of grief, the commerce of grief, the pillaging of even the most private human feelings for political purpose. It is a terrible, violent thing for a state to do to its people. It's not a clever enough subject to speak of from a public platform, but what I would really love to talk to you about is loss. Loss and losing, grief, failure, brokenness, numbness, uncertainty, fear, the death of feeling, the death of dreaming, the absolute, relentless, endless, habitual unfairness of the world. What does loss mean to individuals? What does it mean to whole cultures, whole people who have learned to live with it as a constant companion? Since it is September 11th we're talking about, perhaps it's in the fitness of things that we remember what that date means, not only to those who lost their loved ones in America last year, but to those in other parts of the world to whom that date has long held significance. This historical dredging is not offered as an accusation or a provocation, but just to share the grief of history, to thin the mist a little, to say to the citizens of America in the gentlest, most human way, welcome to the world. 29 years ago in Chile, on the 11th of September 1973, General Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende in a CIA-backed coup. Chile should not be allowed to go Marxist just because its people are irresponsible, said Henry Kissinger, Nobel Peace Laureate, then the US Secretary of State. After the coup, President Allende was found dead inside the presidential palace. Whether he was killed or whether he killed himself, we'll never know. In the regime of terror that ensued, thousands of people were killed. Many more simply disappeared. Firing squads conducted public executions. Concentration camps and torture chambers were opened across the country. The dead were buried in mine shafts and unmarked graves. For 17 years, the people of Chile lived in dread of the midnight knock, of routine disappearances, of sudden arrest and torture. Chileans tell the story of how the musician Victor Jara had his hands cut off in front of a crowd in the Santiago Stadium. Before they shot him, Pinochet's soldiers threw his guitar at him and mockingly asked him to play. In 1999, following the arrest of General Pinochet in Britain, thousands of secret documents were declassified by the US government. They contain unequivocal evidence of the CIA's involvement in the coup, as well as the fact that the US government had detailed information about the situation in Chile during General Pinochet's reign. Yet, Kissinger assured the general of his support. In the United States, as you know, we are sympathetic to what you're trying to do, he said. We wish your government well. Those of us who have only ever known life in a democracy, however flawed, would find it hard to imagine what living in a dictatorship and enduring the absolute loss of freedom means. It isn't just those who Pinochet murdered, but the lives he stole from the living that must be accounted for too. Sadly, Chile was not the only country in South America to be singled out for the US government's attentions. Guatemala, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Brazil, Peru, the Dominican Republic, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Honduras, Panama, El Salvador, Peru, Mexico, and Colombia. They've all been the playground for covert and overt operations by the CIA. Hundreds of thousands of Latin Americans have been killed, tortured, or have simply disappeared under the despotic regimes that were propped up in their countries. If this were not humiliation enough, the people of South America have had to bear the cross of being branded as people who are incapable of democracy, as if coups and massacres are somehow encrypted in their genes. This list does not, of course, include countries in Africa or Asia that suffered US military interventions: Vietnam, Korea, Indonesia, Laos, and Cambodia. For how many Septembers for decades together have millions of Asian people been bombed and burned and slaughtered? How many Septembers have gone by since August 1945, when hundreds of thousands of ordinary Japanese people were obliterated by the nuclear strikes in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? For how many Septembers have the thousands who had the misfortune of surviving those strikes endured the living hell that was visited on them, their unborn children, their children's children, on the earth, the sky, the water, the wind, and all the creatures that swim and walk and crawl and fly? Not far from here in Albuquerque, the National Atomic Museum, where Fat Man and Little Boy, the affectionate nicknames for bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were available as souvenir earrings. Funky young people wore them, a massacre dangling in each ear. But I'm straying from my theme. It's September that we're talking about, not August. September 11th has a tragic resonance in the Middle East too. On the 11th of September 1922, ignoring Arab outrage, the British government proclaimed a mandate in Palestine, a follow-up to the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which Imperial Britain issued with its army massed outside the gates of Gaza. The Balfour Declaration promised European Zionists a national home for Jewish people. At the time, the empire on which the sun never set was free to snatch and bequeath national homes like a school bully distributes marbles. How carelessly imperial power vivisected ancient civilizations. Palestine and Kashmir are Imperial Britain's festering, blood-drenched gifts to the modern world. Both are fault lines in the raging international conflicts of today. In 1937, Winston Churchill said of the Palestinians, I quote, "I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." That set the trend for the Israeli state's attitude towards Palestinians. In 1969, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir said, "Palestinians do not exist." Her successor, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, said, "What are Palestinians? When I came here to Palestine, there were 250,000 non-Jews, mainly Arabs and Bedouins. It was a desert, more than underdeveloped, nothing." Prime Minister Menachem Begin calls Palestinians two-legged beasts. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir called them grasshoppers who could be crushed. This is the language of heads of state, not the words of ordinary people. In 1947, the UN formally partitioned Palestine and allotted 55% of Palestine's land to the Zionists. Within a year, they had captured 76%. On the 14th of May 1948, the State of Israel was declared. Minutes after the declaration, the United States recognized Israel. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan. The Gaza Strip came under Egyptian military control. And formally, Palestine ceased to exist except in the minds and hearts of the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian people who became refugees. In 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Over the decades, there have been uprisings, wars, intifadas. Tens of thousands have lost their lives. Accords and treaties have been signed, ceasefires declared and violated. But the bloodshed doesn't end. Palestine still remains illegally occupied. Its people live in inhuman conditions in virtual Bantustans, where they are subjected to collective punishments, 24-hour curfews, where they are humiliated and brutalized on a daily basis. They never know when their homes will be demolished, when their children will be shot, when their precious trees will be cut, when their roads will be closed, when they will be allowed to walk down to the market to buy food and medicine, and when they will not. They live with no semblance of dignity, with not much hope in sight. They have no control over their lands, their security, their movement, their communication, their water supply. So when accords are signed and words like autonomy and even statehood bandied about, it's always worth asking, what sort of autonomy, what sort of state, what sort of rights will its citizens have? Young Palestinians who cannot control their anger turn themselves into human bombs and haunt Israel's streets and public places, blowing themselves up, killing ordinary people, injecting terror into daily life, and eventually hardening both society's suspicion and mutual hatred of each other. Each bombing invites merciless reprisal and even more hardship on Palestinian people. But then suicide bombing is an act of individual despair, not a revolutionary tactic. Although Palestinian attacks strike terror into Israeli citizens, they provide the perfect cover for the Israeli government's daily incursions into Palestinian territory, the perfect excuse for old-fashioned 19th century colonialism dressed up as a new-fashioned 20th century war. Israel's staunchest political and military ally is, and always has been, the US. The US government has blocked, along with Israel, almost every UN resolution that sought a peaceful, equitable solution to the conflict. It has supported almost every war that Israel has fought. When Israel attacks Palestine, it is American missiles that smash through Palestinian homes. And every year, Israel receives several $billion from the United States, taxpayers' money. What lessons should we draw from this tragic conflict? Is it really impossible for Jewish people who suffered so cruelly themselves, more cruelly perhaps than any other people in history, to understand the vulnerability and the yearning of those whom they have displaced? Does extreme suffering always kindle cruelty? What hope does this leave the human race with? What will happen to the Palestinian people in the event of a victory? When a nation without a state eventually proclaims a state, what kind of state will it be? What horrors will be perpetrated under its flag? Is it a separate state that we should be fighting for, or the rights to a life of liberty and dignity for everyone, regardless of their ethnicity or religion? Palestine was once a secular bulwark in the Middle East, but now the weak, undemocratic, by all accounts corrupt but avowedly non-sectarian PLO is losing ground to Hamas, which espouses an overtly sectarian ideology and fights in the name of Islam. To quote from their manifesto, "We will be its soldiers and the firewood of its fire, which will burn the enemies." The world is called upon to condemn suicide bombers, but can we ignore the long road they have journeyed on before they arrived at this destination? September 11th, 1922 to September 11th, 2002. 80 years is a long time to have been waging war. Is there some advice the world can give the people of Palestine? Should they just take Golda Meir's suggestion and make a real effort not to exist? In another part of the Middle East, September 11th strikes a more recent chord. It was on the 11th of September, 1990, that George W. Bush Sr., then President of the US, made a speech to a joint session of Congress announcing his government's decision to go to war against Iraq. The US government says that Saddam Hussein is a war criminal, a cruel military despot who has committed genocide against his own people. That's a fairly accurate description of the man. In 1988, Saddam Hussein razed hundreds of villages in northern Iraq and used chemical weapons and machine guns to kill thousands of Kurdish people. Today we know that that same year, the US government provided him with $500 million in subsidies to buy American farm products. The next year, after he had successfully completed his genocidal campaign, the US government doubled its subsidy to $1 billion. It also provided him with high-quality germ seed for anthrax and helicopters and dual-use material that could be used to manufacture chemical and biological weapons. So it turns out that while Saddam Hussein was carrying out his worst atrocities, the US and the UK governments were his close allies. So what changed? In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. His sin was not so much that he had committed an act of war, but that he had acted independently without orders from his master. This display of independence was enough to upset the power equation in the Gulf. So it was decided that Saddam Hussein be exterminated like a pet that has outlived its owner's affection. The first Allied attack on Iraq took place in January 91. The world watched the primetime war as it was played out on TV. In India those days, you had to go to a 5-star hotel lobby to watch CNN. Tens of thousands of people were killed in a month of devastating bombing. What many do not know is that the war never ended then. The initial fury simmered down into the longest sustained air attack on a country since the Vietnam War. Over the last decade, American and British forces have fired thousands of missiles and bombs on Iraq. In the decade of economic sanctions that followed the war, Iraqi civilians have been denied food, medicine, hospital equipment, ambulances, clean water, the basic essentials. About 500,000 Iraqi children have died as a result of the sanctions. Of them, Madeleine Albright, then US ambassador to the United Nations, famously said, "It's a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it." Moral equivalence was the term that was used to denounce those of us who criticized the war on Afghanistan. Madeleine Albright cannot be accused of moral equivalence. What she said was just straightforward algebra. A decade of bombing has not managed to dislodge Saddam Hussein, the beast of Baghdad. Now, almost 12 years on, President George Bush Jr. has ratcheted up the rhetoric once again. He's proposing an all-out war whose goal is nothing short of a regime change. The New York Times says that the Bush administration is, quote, following a meticulously planned strategy to persuade the public, the Congress, and the allies of the need to confront the threat of Saddam Hussein. Andrew H. Card Jr., the White House Chief of Staff, described how the administration was stepping up its war plans for the fall. And I quote, "From a marketing point of view," he said, "you don't introduce new products in August." This time, the catchphrase for Washington's new product is not the plight of Kuwaiti people, but the assertion that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. "Forget the feckless moralizing of peace lobbies," wrote Richard Pearl, a former advisor to President Bush. "We need to get him before he gets us." Weapons inspectors have conflicting reports of the status of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, and many have said clearly that its arsenal has been dismantled and that it does not have the capacity to build one. However, there is no confusion over the extent and range of America's arsenal of nuclear and chemical weapons. Would the US government welcome weapons inspectors? Would the UK or Israel? What if Iraq does have a nuclear weapon? Does that justify a preemptive US strike? The US has the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, and it's the only country in the world to have actually used them on civilian populations. If the US is justified in launching a preemptive strike on Iraq, why then any nuclear power is justified in carrying out a preemptive strike on any other? India could attack Pakistan, or the other way around. If the US government develops a distaste for, say, the Indian Prime Minister, can it just take him out with a preemptive strike? Recently, the United States played an important part in forcing India and Pakistan back from the brink of war. Is it so hard for it to take its own advice? Who is guilty of feckless moralizing, of preaching peace while it wages war? The US, which George Bush has called the most peaceful nation on earth, has been at war with one country or another every year for the last 50 years. Wars are never fought for altruistic reasons. They're usually fought for hegemony, for business. And then, of course, there's the business of war. Protecting its control of the world's oil is fundamental to US foreign policy. The US government's recent military interventions in the Balkans and Central Asia have to do with oil. Hamid Karzai, the puppet president of Afghanistan, installed by the US, is said to be a former employee of Unocal, the American-based oil company. The US government's paranoid patrolling of the Middle East is because it has 2/3 of the world's oil reserves. Oil keeps America's engines purring sweetly. Oil keeps the free market rolling. Whoever controls the world's oil controls the world's market. And how do you control the oil? Nobody puts it more elegantly than the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman. In an article called "Craziness Pays," he said, quote, "The US has to make it clear to Iraq and US allies that America will use force without negotiation, hesitation, or UN approval." His advice was well taken in the wars against Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as in the almost daily humiliation the US government heaps on the UN. In his book on globalization, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, Friedman says, and I quote, "The hidden hand of the market will never work without the hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas. And the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley's technologies to flourish is called the US Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps." Perhaps this was written in a moment of vulnerability, but it's certainly the most succinct, accurate description of the project of corporate globalization that I have read. After the 11th of September 2001 and the war against terror, the hidden hand and fist have had their cover blown, and we have a clear view now of America's other weapon, the free market, bearing down on the developing world with a clenched, unsmiling smile. The task that never ends is America's perfect war, the perfect vehicle for the endless expansion of American imperialism. In Urdu, the word for profit, as in P-R-O-F-I-T, is faida. Al-Qaeda means the word of God, the law. So in India, some of us call the war against terror Al-Qaeda versus Al-Faida, the word versus the prophet, no pun intended. For the moment, it looks as though Al-Faida will carry the day, but then you never know. In the last 10 years of unbridled corporate globalization, the world's total income has increased by an average of 2.5% a year. And yet, the number of poor in the world has increased by 100 million. Of the top 100 biggest economies, 51 are corporations, not countries. The top 1% of the world has the same combined income as the bottom 57%, and that disparity is growing. And now, under the spreading canopy of the war against terror, this process is being hustled along. The men in suits are in an unseemly hurry, while bombs rain down on us and cruise missiles skid across the skies, while nuclear weapons are stockpiled to make the world a safer place. Contracts are being signed, patents are being registered, oil pipelines are being laid, natural resources are being plundered, water is being privatized, and democracies are being undermined. In a country like India, the structural adjustment end of the corporate globalization project is ripping through people's lives. Development projects, massive privatization, and labor reforms are pushing people off their lands and out of their jobs, resulting in a kind of barbaric dispossession that has few parallels in history. Across the world, as the free market brazenly protects Western markets and forces developing countries to lift their trade barriers, the poor are getting poorer and the rich richer. Civil unrest has begun to erupt in the global village. In countries like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Bolivia, and India, the resistance movements against corporate globalization are growing. To contain them, governments are tightening their control. Protesters are being labeled terrorists and then being dealt with as such. But civil unrest does not only mean marches and demonstrations and protests against globalization. Unfortunately, it also means a desperate downward spiral into crime and chaos and all kinds of despair and disillusionment, which, as we know from history and from what we see unspooling before our eyes, gradually becomes a fertile breeding ground for terrible things: cultural nationalism, religious bigotry, fascism, and of course, terrorism. All these march arm in arm with corporate globalization. There is a notion gaining credence that the free market breaks down national barriers and that corporate globalization's ultimate destination is a hippie paradise where the heart is the only passport and we all live happily together inside a John Lennon song. Imagine there's no country. But this is a canard. What the free market undermines is not national sovereignty, but democracy. As the disparity between the rich and poor grows, the hidden fist has its work cut out for it. Multinational corporations on the prowl for sweetheart deals that yield enormous profits cannot push through those deals and administer those projects in developing countries without the active connivance of state machinery, the police, the courts, sometimes even the army. Today, corporate globalization needs an international confederation of loyal, corrupt, preferably authoritarian governments in poorer countries to push through unpopular reforms and quell the mutinies. It needs a press that pretends to be free. It needs courts that pretend to dispense justice. It needs nuclear bombs, standing armies, sterner immigration laws, and watchful coastal patrols to make sure that it's only money, goods, patents, and services that are being globalized, not the free movement of people, not a respect for human rights, not international treaties on racial discrimination, or chemical and nuclear weapons, or greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, or, God forbid, justice. It's as though even a gesture towards international accountability would wreck the whole enterprise. Close to 1 year after the war against terror was officially flagged off in the ruins of Afghanistan, in country after country, freedoms are being curtailed in the name of protecting freedom. Civil liberties are being suspended in the name of protecting democracy. All kinds of dissent is being defined as terrorism. All kinds of laws are being passed to deal with it. Osama bin Laden seems to have vanished into thin air. Mullah Omar is supposed to have made his escape on a motorbike. They could have sent Tintin after him. The Taliban may have disappeared, but their spirit and their system of summary justice is surfacing in the unlikeliest of places, in India, in Pakistan, in Nigeria, in America, in all the Central Asian republics run by all manner of despots, and of course in Afghanistan under the US-backed Northern Alliance. Meanwhile, down at the mall there's a mid-season sale. Everything's discounted: oceans, rivers, oil, gene pools, fig wasps, flowers, childhoods, aluminium factories, phone companies, wisdom, wilderness, civil rights, ecosystems, air, all 4,600 million years of evolution. It's packed, sealed, tagged, valued, and available off the rack. No returns. As for justice, I'm told it's on offer too. You can get the best that money can buy. Donald Rumsfeld said that his mission in the war against terror was to persuade the world that Americans must be allowed to continue their way of life. When the maddened king stamps his foot, slaves tremble in their quarters. So standing here today, it's hard for me to say this, but the American way of life is simply not sustainable because it doesn't acknowledge that there is a world beyond America. But fortunately, power has a shelf life. When the time comes, maybe this mighty empire will, like others before it, overreach itself and implode from within. It looks as though structural cracks have already appeared. As the war against terror casts its net wider and wider, America's corporate heart is hemorrhaging. For all the endless, empty chatter about democracy, today the world is run by three of the most secretive institutions in the world: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, all three of which in turn are dominated by the US. Their decisions are made in secret. The people who head them are appointed behind closed doors. Nobody really knows anything about them, their politics, their beliefs, their intentions. Nobody elected them. Nobody said they could make decisions on our behalf. A world run by a handful of greedy bankers and CEOs who nobody elected can't possibly last. Soviet-style communism failed not because it was intrinsically evil, but because it was flawed. It allowed too few people to usurp too much power. 21st century market capitalism, American style, will fail for the same reasons. Both are edifices constructed by the human intelligence, undone by human nature. The time has come, the walrus said. Perhaps things will become worse and then better. Perhaps there's a small God up in heaven readying herself for us. Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. Maybe many of us won't be here to greet her, but on a quiet day, if I listen very carefully, I can hear her breathing. Thank you.
Arundhati just said to me, well, we can now talk about the things that I left out. Well, I guess. What did you leave out? You know, I was sitting there listening to you and thinking, there it was. There it is.
Okay, let's go.
You don't want me to say anything nice about, no. Okay, no. But really, what I thought I was sitting there is, it was this mastery of detail, all expressed in the most poetic and beautiful way. That combination is so hard to achieve. I know this is not a lead-in to a conversation. It's a final statement. You see. But let me ask you this, Arundhati. How did you come to decide, after writing The God of Small Things, that you were not going to immediately sit down and write another novel?
Well, I would have had to decide to sit down and write another novel. In that, I never, I've never believed in this thing of having a single profession and sort of doing the same thing all your life. It feels like your brain is growing in one direction, like some tumor. And a lot of people keep saying to me that you must be under a lot of pressure from your publishers to write another book. Well, I think it's a bit dishonest to put it that way for me, because no one can pressurize me, they don't have a handle on me. It's only if I wanted to accept that pressure that it would be a pressure. And I just think that very soon after I finished writing The God of Small Things and it came out, India did, its nuclear tests, and I recognized the fact that here was the papers and lots of public people and writers and painters, and everybody was standing up and applauding this horrible act. And I realized then that staying quiet was as political an act as speaking out, and I had the space to make a statement. And if I didn't, it was something that I couldn't live with, which was when I wrote The End of Imagination. And also I think being involved in the kinds of things I've been involved in the last few years have been wonderful for me, because I've met the most extraordinary people, I've been close to the most extraordinary political happenings, and I also know that when I'm ready to write another book, if I'm ready to write, I keep saying The God of Small Things was a collaboration between me and a little bit of magic. And you have to know how to wait, It'll come. If it doesn't, that's all right. But if it does, it'll come. You can't just, it's not some factory product.
No one would accuse that of being a factory product.
No, I mean the next.
No.
And the next.
But it was interesting what you said about, that turning to the political world, from writing a novel, you encountered people. You suddenly found all these people that you could work with and do things with. And the writer working alone, writing a novel or a poem, doesn't experience that. And the writers who never come out of their study, or out of their agent's office, right? And get out into the struggle and turmoil of the world, they are missing something, very, very important.
I think, the truth is that I was actually always a political person. Obviously, it's not something that suddenly happens to you. So when I was studying architecture, by the time I was in 4th year, I knew that I would never practice architecture, and I had become very interested in town planning and how cities came to be the way they were, and how land use plans and architectural plans are designed to exclude most people and make them illegal, and the whole business of the citizen and the non-citizen. So in a sense, The God of Small Things is also a very political book. And I think I don't think I ever, obviously I was never the kind of person who was only in their agent's office, because I didn't have an agent. I didn't even know there were such things until, I wrote The God of Small Things.
I'm sorry to have brought it up.
But you're right. I think the business of getting into the world, living your life, living, and then writing about what you live is what interests me, and the idea that, I live in times, and I think those times are here in America now, but they've been in India for a while, where when you write something, the worst thing that can happen to you is not a bad review. It's somehow it's injected directly into life, and you never know what's going to happen if you write a book. The God of Small Things, I was, of course, taken to court for corrupting public morality,
yes.
which I had a technical problem with, because I said at least he should have said further corrupting public morality.
But when I read about that charge against you, I immediately went back to the God of Small Things, because I wanted to see what pages there were, that were possibly corrupting public morality, and I found them, and it was wonderful. Yeah. But you said before you were always a political person. Well, not from the age of 3 or 4 or 5, but you said something about, when you were somehow finishing work at the School of Architecture, at some point you decided, no, this was not for you. So did something happen?
Well, actually, absurdly, it does start from the age of 3 or 4, because I lived in a, my mother came from this very little village in Kerala called Aimanam, and she belongs to a very parochial community called the Syrian Christians, and she married a Bengali, outside the community, and then made the mistake of marrying him and then divorcing him, and came back to the village. And so we grew up sort of outside the realm of all the protections that society chose to offer its members. And so from a very young age, one was aware of the fact that you were not going to be given those protections. And you had to constantly try to understand what was going on and how to survive in this space, and how not to go under. And so my mother was is very political in not in this overt way, but I think the minute you lose the protection of this nuclear family that protects you from the world, you're on your own, and then politics is in your life. You have to ride the waves, you have to understand it.
But you were on your own as a woman, which is a special situation. Not just in India, I suppose, being a woman on your own anywhere is something to deal with, but I imagine that maybe in India there was something about that.
Yeah, it was. Though my mother and I are great mates now, when I was 17, I left home and I was on my own, being that woman, as the Supreme Court judges rightly call me. And I think you see what happens in India is that the the real life is so frightening that the middle class really protects itself and really turns inwards, and it's almost blind. It's almost like they have some lenses that fall over their eyes, and they can't see the horrors around, because that's the only way to survive in some sense. And and I think when you fall out of that cozy little nest and there's no safety net, you realize that it's not all that horrible actually, and I don't think you can ever unlearn that once you've been there, however briefly or however temporarily. You don't forget, you don't forget whatever happens to you. I keep thinking that there are people in the world who are safe and there are people in the world who are unsafe. And if you're unsafe, you always seek out the unsafe. Whatever happens to you in your life, you're always sort of taking that walk. So it was the best university, I think, to go to.
It's interesting what you say about the middle class blinding itself, protecting itself from what is happening to so much of the population. And this is so much the history of the United States, which developed perhaps the largest middle class, and as the United States has had enough wealth so it could bribe enough people in the population to create a middle class which became useful as a buffer between the very rich and that part of the population which could not even rise into the middle class, and so the middle class in the United States has always been sort of enticed by the establishment into thinking that it can rise into the upper class, and not told that it can also descend. But the result is the United States educational system teaches us from the very beginning that we're not a class society. To use the term class in the United States, it's just a term used for school, right? This is my class, thing. But the idea of a class society is something that has always made people in power nervous. If anybody brings up the idea of class conflict, class struggle, you mustn't talk about that. And we're brought up in the United States to believe that we're one big happy family.
And aren't you?
And it's we all have the same interest. We have the language to try to make that imprint on the American people. The language of national interest. The phrase is national interest, as assuming, we all have the same interest. Exxon and I have the same interest.
Enron and I.
Enron and you, yes. And so it takes. But there's a perception that people in the United States have growing up, especially people in the working classes of the United States. They know that their interests in Exxon are not the same, and they show it.
Well, the thing is, in India, it's so complicated that sometimes the longer you live there, the more confused you get. Because it's when you think of class in India, you have so many other things too. You have caste, which is a complex business because I grew up in Kerala, which had the first ever democratically elected Marxist government in the world. But all the leaders of the Marxist party are Brahmins, you know. So it's it's a very complex way in which they use all these things to, you know, the Indian democracies must be one of the most fascinating beasts on earth. And then you have such a complicated network of region and religion and language. So you have a situation where you have a country where we have, I think it's 18 or 19 official languages, and then there are hundreds of dialects, and you can't, the Supreme Court functions in English. Nobody can understand what's going on in there. I mean, even if you speak English, you can't understand, but
yes.
Like, imagine when they gave a judgment about me, they said, vicious stultification and vulgar debunking cannot be permitted to pollute the pure stream of justice.
Well, that's what you were doing.
And that's what I'm doing, but I had to really look up the dictionary to figure out what they meant. And at the end of it, they just kept saying, but the respondent is not behaving like a reasonable man. And at least I can follow what they're saying, but you know, the people from the Narmada, they have no idea what is this court and how do you file a police case, or if there's a police case filed against you, what does it say? What are you, you know, it's just like living, it's like, I keep thinking it's like if I were living in Czechoslovakia or something, how would I function? And that's the way most Indians have to function in India. So it's...
You know, we don't understand our Supreme Court either. And the whole object of going to law school,
not meant to understand.
You know, is to not allow people to understand what you're saying.
In fact, that's one of the reasons that the court got very angry with me, was because when they filed this case, I said I won't get a lawyer and I will write my own reply, which I did. And it was perfectly legal. I mean, you know, I checked it with a lawyer, but it was written in language that ordinary people could understand. It was published in the press, and that they didn't like. So every time I went to court, they got a rash. You know, it was like, why is she here? Take her away.
Yeah. Well, defending yourself is not something you're supposed to do, because you're taking a job away from people, you know, who are desperately unemployed and they need work, and so they don't like people to defend themselves. But it's interesting. During the Vietnam War, we began to get used to people defending themselves in court, because we had, you know, these anti-war protesters were part of this new 60s generation. You know, forget the experts, forget the professionals. We don't have any faith in them. All these lawyers are over 30. You know, we don't trust professionals, and we want to speak for ourselves. I mean, it was such a refreshing thing, actually, that they were breaking through this notion that somebody must speak for you, and so in trial after trial that took place of anti-war protesters, people represented themselves, which made judges very nervous, you know, made the prosecution very nervous, but enabled, you know, the honest feelings of the defendants to come across, you know, to the court.
But in India, actually the whole thing about contempt of court, it has a very sinister edge to it, because see, the Supreme Court is actually the most powerful institution in India, and as the government and the politicians get more and more corrupt, the Supreme Court has started making huge decisions on their behalf. So the Supreme Court decides whether a dam should be built or not, whether slums should be cleared or not, whether industry should be in the city or outside, whether privatization should be, you know, endorsed, whether structural adjustment is a good thing or not. All these decisions which affect the lives of millions of people are being taken now in the Supreme Court. And the Contempt of Court Act, law, says that while you can criticize a judgment, you cannot say, put a series of judgments together and say, what is the Supreme Court up to? What is the politics of the Supreme Court? If I supposing I had evidence that a Supreme Court judge was corrupt, supposing I had him on film taking a bribe, it's not admissible in court because you can't lower the dignity of the court by saying that a judge is corrupt.
Yeah.
This is the situation, you know. And so, you know, even when I went to prison for contempt of court and came out, we had a big press conference. There were hundreds of journalists. A lot of senior editors spoke out quite bravely about this act because they are most scared of the court, more scared of the court than of politicians. And you know, a normal journalist, it's not that you're going to have a death sentence if you commit contempt of court, but 6 months in prison, you're going to lose your job, you're going to have maybe 2 or 3 years of a criminal trial, you have to hire a lawyer, no one's willing to take the risk. So there's just dead silence on that subject, you know. It's very, very frightening, and that's what I said in my affidavit. A judicial dictatorship is as bad as any other kind of dictatorship.
Now we have a situation where the Supreme Court does make decisions which are important, but not usually on the most important things. And by that I mean on issues of war and peace. That is, when it comes to issues of war and peace, the Supreme Court may just as well not exist.
Yeah, well, that's
They
true.
defer to the power of the president, just as Congress defers to the power of the president. There's no democracy in foreign policy. I mean, you brought up the issue, and you said democracy in India is very complicated. Well, democracy in the United States is very complicated because we have democracy and we don't have democracy. It's here and it's not here.
It's gone.
Yeah, and you have democracy, you know, once in 4 years for a moment.
Yeah.
And even there you don't have democracy.
Yeah.
You see, you know, but you have, you know, you're supposed to have political democracy with elected representatives and so on. You know, but you certainly don't have economic democracy. You don't have democracy in the workplace. You don't have democracy in everyday life. And so, you know, there's a pretense that you have democracy in political life, but in all
you have elections.
Yes.
Elections are democracy.
Yeah, elections. I mean, imagine just, you know, you go into the voting booth and you pull the chain, or you, and you know, and you have fulfilled your duty, you know, and that's it. And then you can sit back and let the president do what he wants. And you know, during the Vietnam War, you know, there are Americans who are naive enough to believe the Constitution of the United States, or to believe what they learned in junior high school about American democracy, and they learned that we have 3 branches of everybody learns the same thing. You know, you must have some very things that everybody learns, right? And here we learn we have 3 branches of government. The teacher always makes a diagram on the board, which is very, because you know you can't imagine it in your head, you see. And so, you know, you can keep 2 things, but not 3 things in your head. And so you have 3 branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And what you learn is that there are checks and balances, and that each branch is there to check the other. And when you sit there as a young person, you say, this is marvelous. Nothing bad can happen, you see. And then you grow up, and you see nothing but bad things happen. And you see, and during the Vietnam War, you see, the president decides on war, or I should say the president and the people around him. Some of them are known to the public, others not known to the public. But the president and the people around him decide on war. he goes to Congress. I mean, to me, it's absurd that liberal people today, the most courage that some congressman can muster up against the war in Iraq is to say, let Congress vote on it. You see, it's as if we don't know the history of congressional obsequiousness. You know, if we don't know the history of Congress approving every war that has ever been fought in one way, or another. What happened during the Vietnam War is that a number of GIs, and this is one of the glorious things about the Vietnam War was the uprising of soldiers against the war and the organization of Vietnam veterans against the war. Wonderful dramatic scenes of that kind of resistance. And there were these GIs who refused to go to Vietnam, and they said, the Constitution says Congress must declare war. Congress has not declared war. And they had learned in junior high school that the job of the Supreme Court is to see to it that things are constitutional. So they appealed to the Supreme Court. And what did the Supreme Court do? It said, we can't handle this. It's funny, you think, the Supreme Court, they have black robes. You think they have power, and they shrink into the distance as soon as war appears. And so it's left then to the people, which happened during the Vietnam War. And I think what you're talking about in India, it's left to the people of India. When I saw that film, the wonderful film was made about Arundhati's little tiff with the Supreme Court. I didn't know how to describe it. I didn't want to say a war with the Supreme Court.
Flotation.
But a little encounter with, but there's a wonderful film made about it, which you should see. And it was great to see those huge crowds of people supporting you, during that. And I'm sure it was because of those huge crowds that the Supreme Court, went easy on you, didn't sentence you to life imprisonment, right?
No, life was not on the cards, fortunately.
Yeah. But I like what you said about that in India there's a kind of inherent anarchism which will save India one day.
Yeah. I think it's like trying to corporatize India is like trying to put an iron grid on the ocean. I just think even the fascists are not disciplined there, so hopefully they'll mess it up.
Well, I think we can count on them to mess it up.
Yeah, I hope so.
We need that. I mean, because we'll try our best, and we'll accomplish a lot, but we do really need them to mess it up.
Absolutely.
But I think we can count on it, because they do it.
They do it. The only trouble, Howard, is that in India right now, I think few Americans know about this, but in March this year, the BJP, which is the Bharatiya Janata Party, is part of what they call the Sangh Parivar, which is the whole sort of family of Hindu right-wing organizations. The BJP is the political end of it, and what's called the RSS, which is the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, is the cultural guild. Now the Prime Minister, the Home Minister, the Disinvestment Minister, all these people belong to the RSS. The RSS has been preparing the ground for this kind of right-wing, India is only for the Hindus thing since the late 20s. And they are open admirers of Hitler and his methods and so on. And in March this year, there was a massacre of Muslims in Gujarat. And as soon as the massacre was over, the Gujarat government, headed by the BJP, wanted to hold elections because they felt that they would win the elections because they had polarized the vote. And all over India, they have what are called shakhas, which are branches where young people, 10-year-old children, are being indoctrinated into religious bigotry and hatred and how to create communal trouble, and how to rewrite history books, and all this is happening. So the fascists will definitely mess it up. In fact, the reason they are so desperate is because in state after state they were losing the elections. But you see now, whether they are in power or not, they've injected this poison into the veins of a very complex country. And that's very frightening, very, very frightening to have to deal with on a daily basis, because you cannot imagine the things that happened in Gujarat. Little children 2,000 people were killed. Women were raped. Women had their stomachs slit open and their fetuses pulled out. Not one or two, but many, many. Little children were forced to drink petrol, and then matches were put down their throats. They just blew up like bombs. So it's a very, very frightening situation just now. And this government in India keeps saying that we're natural allies of the US. So there hasn't, it's not just a coincidence that this was not reported or that it's being suppressed. The whole nuclear flashpoint with Pakistan was mostly due to the fact that the Indian government wanted to distract attention from the world's attention from Gujarat to this, and it was very, very successful in doing that.
Well, if I hadn't read what you wrote about Gujarat and what happened there, I would never have known, because people in the United States do not know what's happening in India.
Yeah.
In fact, people in the United States generally know very little about what is happening in the rest of the world.
Thanks to the free press.
Yeah, yes. And it's clear that what we need more and more, is this, interchange across boundaries.
Yeah.
And the
real globalization.
Yeah, people's globalization. You talk about that, and because I sort of feel like, I see the world with sort of chalk lines dividing everybody, and I see us as having the job of little by little walking across those
and rubbing them
and
out.
rubbing those chalk lines out.
That's why I keep saying that I think literature is the opposite of a nuclear bomb. When I wrote The God of Small Things, I would go to Estonia and Finland and hear from China, and people say, oh, but this was my childhood. One of the reasons why I never wanted it to be made into a film was because I thought there are 6 or 7 million films going on in people's heads, and this one filmmaker will come and take it away, Let it be the world's childhood. And the idea that there is that, that there is, the human beings across the world do share love and terror and gentleness and these things which literature links up, and which nuclear bombs just build the walls and separate.
I think your coming here does that. Not only your writing does that, but you're coming here and us listening to you and knowing that we are part of a cuirass. I don't know if any of you read Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle. Kurt Vonnegut is this remarkable, this remarkable, interesting, odd mind, you say. And in Cat's Cradle, he talks of a cuirass. Says, cuirass when people feel an affinity with one another. They don't know exactly why, but it crosses all lines. It crosses national, racial, sexual, it crosses all lines. But that's what we depend on.
Yeah, it's like I've never been to Pakistan. Delhi and Pakistan, Lahore are maybe a 1-hour flight away from each other. I went to Pakistan last month. I had to go from Delhi to Dubai to Islamabad to Lahore. It took me 18 hours. And, there's so much in the Indian press and equally in the Pakistan press about anti-India demonstrations and anti-Pakistan demonstrations, and we're all going to kill each other and everybody hates everybody and so on. I landed in Lahore, and within, seconds, we were all sitting at this dining table, and I felt like I was in Delhi. It was just so sad. And the audience that came, people were just in tears, not because of me or what I said or anything, just because it's such a relief not to always be subjected to this media's representation of government positions, you know. And I really feel that the media, the corporate media has played a terrible part in all this, and people are just going to have to blow holes in this dam between them and you know, insist on listening to independent, real voices, real human beings.
No. Yes. We were saying to one another, when you were not listening, it's very hard to end a conversation on stage. And so the thought was that we would finish by Arundhati reading something that you would like to read to all of us.
Okay. It'll just be 2 minutes, and I just want to leave you with a thought, with a way of seeing. This is part of the essay that I wrote when India tested nuclear weapons in 1998. It's quite a long essay, so this is just a very small extract, the very personal part of it. In early May 1998, I left home for 3 weeks. While I was away, I met a friend of mine whom I've always loved for, among other things, her ability to combine deep affection with a frankness bordering on savagery. I've been thinking about you, she said, about the God of small things, what's in it, what's over it, under it, around it, above it. She fell silent for a while. I was uneasy and not at all sure that I wanted to hear the rest of what she had to say. She, however, was sure that she was going to say it. In this last year, less than a year actually, you've had too much of everything. Fame, money, prizes, adulation, criticism, condemnation, ridicule, love, hate, anger, envy, generosity, everything. In some ways, it's a perfect story, perfectly baroque in its excess. The trouble is that it has, or can have, only one perfect ending. Her eyes were on me, bright with a slanting, probing brilliance. She knew that I knew what she was going to say. She was insane. She was going to say that nothing that happened to me in the future could ever match the buzz of this, that the whole of the rest of my life was going to be vaguely dissatisfying, and therefore the only perfect ending to the story would be death. My death. You've lived too long in New York, I told her. There are other worlds, other kinds of dreams. Dreams in which failure is feasible, honorable, sometimes even worth striving for. Worlds in which recognition is not the only barometer of brilliance or human worth. There are plenty of warriors that I know and love, people far more valuable than myself, who go to war each day, knowing in advance that they will fail. True, they're less successful in the most vulgar sense of the word, but by no means less fulfilled. The only dream worth having, I told her, is to dream that you will live while you're alive and die only when you're dead, which means exactly what, she said, looking a little annoyed. I tried to explain, but didn't do a very good job of it, because sometimes I need to write to think. So I wrote it down for her on a paper napkin, and this is what I wrote. To love, to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect strength, never power, Above all, to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget. Thank you.